Good morning, and thank you for joining the Office of Congresswoman Lauren Underwood for a discussion on engaging in the appropriations process. We have a few presenters today, so as you have questions, please ask them in the Q&A function of the webinar. We will also take questions at the end of the webinar. Just a reminder, we are recording the webinar and plan to share it publicly. We have a few materials that we will share with you in the chat function. Congresswoman Underwood will not be able to join us today, unfortunately, due to votes. So at this time, I would like to introduce Carolyn Paris-Bear, the Congresswoman's Legislative Director.
Hi, everyone. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Carolyn Paris-Bear, and I am the Congresswoman's Legislative Director in Washington, D.C., for those of you who I haven't met. I'm going to share my screen so we can run through this brief slideshow on Appropriations 101. I want to cover a few housekeeping matters before we start. You should have already received our Appropriations FAQ and our Grant Resource Guide, but if not, both are available on our website at underwood.house.gov. And we'll also share the slide deck and a recording of the webinar for you to refer to if helpful. As Michelle mentioned, we'll save time for questions at the end. So please use the Q&A function in Zoom for that as well. The last thing I want to emphasize is that this is not a one-time conversation. It's really a process. Our office is here to serve as a resource throughout that process. And so please reach out to myself, reach out to Jessica, reach out to Michelle. We are all here for you. All right, so let's start by taking sort of a high-level look at how the different ways that Congresswoman Underwood and her staff can bring federal resources to the 14th. So the first of these is grants. Grants allow the federal government to fund organizations and projects that serve the public good. So that's food banks to fire departments, local governments, anywhere in between. There's a couple different types of grants. They're not the focus of this workshop, but I'll just touch on them briefly so you have some familiarity with the terms if you don't already. Discretionary grants are competitive grants. An individual applies for them directly. Formula grants are awarded based on statistical criteria for certain types of work. And block grants are a lump sum, usually to a larger unit of government for a broader purpose. The next way we can help bring resources home is through the appropriations process, which of course we're here to talk about today. This is the process of allocating funding across the federal government. So we'll go more into depth in the next few slides, but the biggest distinction is that the congressional budget process distinguishes between appropriations, which finance the activities of the federal government, and authorizations, which establish or define those activities. Authorizing legislation is the third big way we have to make an impact. So that's that legislation that edits the statute and substance of existing laws and programs. Let's see. For example, a good example of this would be Congresswoman Underwood's legislation to restore the state and local tax deduction. So that's something that obviously has a big impact on budgets, but wouldn't be appropriations. And then the last way is working with a federal agency on your behalf. So we can liaise with federal agencies if you're having trouble getting a response or need more information, or maybe you want some more personalized feedback. We have really good working relationships and can be a resource to you there. I'm going to move on to our next slide. What is the congressional appropriations process and how does it work? So the term appropriations comes right from the US Constitution, which gives Congress the authority to decide how federal funds are spent. So the bills that contain appropriations policy are known as appropriations measures. Every member of Congress has an opportunity to weigh in through submitting their requests. The appropriations process takes place every year. And so it's helpful to have an idea of the general timelines so you can plan around your organization's financial calendar. We also on our form ask pretty much the same information year over year. So what you'll see on our form this year and in previous years will be carried forward. So that will help you with your planning, hopefully. So before the new year, it's great to look at your budget and start identifying your needs. The appropriations process kicks off in the new year. In the first quarter, typically we go through the request process. That's when you have finished IDing your needs and submit your requests. As early as possible is generally good for this. Even if you don't submit them formally, reach out to us early so we can work with you to make sure they're in the best possible shape. We are really lucky to have Anna from NIU here later, who's going to talk a little bit more about doing that from an organization perspective. In the second quarter of the year, the Appropriations Committee synthesizes these requests. We get $70,000 a year and writes the bills. So traditionally, spending legislation originates in the House. So the House will write it, pass it, usually before August. So we'll typically pass these bills out of the House by July. Then in quarters 3 and 4, the work kicks over to the Senate. They have their own parallel process. They will pass their own bills, and then the House and the Senate will go to conference and will come out ideally with a bill that we can all agree on. As you may know, but there's been some delays in this process in recent years, but we're hoping for slightly more regular order in the upcoming cycle. So I'll touch briefly on the House Committee on Appropriations. These are the committees that write the actual appropriations measures, and Congresswoman Underwood was chosen by her colleagues to serve on the committee in December 2020. First-term members aren't eligible to join. I think she is now the youngest member on the committee. What this means for our community is that Rep. Underwood is literally writing the bills. She has more opportunities to weigh in and more opportunities to elevate the needs of our community in Northern Illinois. She serves on 2 subcommittees. Those subcommittees are Agriculture and Rural Development. That subcommittee also has jurisdiction over the FDA, and Homeland Security. So this includes DHS, but it also includes a lot of grants that serve our communities that come out of FEMA, grants that help deal with flooding, with security, with protecting our communities, grants that firefighters and local first responders are eligible for. So there's a lot, especially within the Homeland space, and I encourage you to look there. So submitting an appropriations request, there's really 3 steps. So the first is to identify the existing federal support that your community or organization receives. So this can come in a couple different forms. First example would be direct funding from the federal government. So that's funding that will just go directly to you, pretty easy to identify. The second example is what's called pass-through funding, where the federal government gives money to the state or the county, or oftentimes a larger unit of government, and then it's distributed by that government to smaller organizations. The third way is support for federal contracts or partnerships. I really encourage businesses in district to think about the appropriations process in addition to local organizations and governments. What federal resources help your business thrive? If you rely on a certain federal government resource to, run your company, help us protect it. Help us help you protect it. So a good example is Scott Forge, a local company in district that makes parts for a lot of things for NASA, but most recently they made the wheels, I believe, on the Perseverance rover that landed last week. And what we've been able to do throughout the appropriations process is help make sure that Scott Forge's work with NASA continues and is productive while serving sort of the best needs of the people. So the next thing you'll want to do is identify your organization's needs. Like I said, Anna will have a really good way of, has a really good presentation for you coming on that. And then submit your request online. We have a Google form. It's very simple. We're going to walk through it now. You may have already looked at it. I know Michelle's been sending it around. So a big question is around identifying this federal funding. So a question we hear a lot is, should I be looking at grants or appropriations requests? So the easiest way to tell is by identifying your existing sources of federal support. If you don't currently have federal support for your specific need, you should start by exploring grants. We have an amazing grant resource guide that will get you started. It's written by Jessica, who's on this call, and she and the rest of our district team are available to help in a number of ways. We'll also be hosting a similar workshop on grants in the near future. If you do currently have federal support, whether that's a grant, other funding, a partnership with a national lab, you should submit an appropriations request to help us protect or expand those federal resources for you. Let's move on to walk through our slide. So our form is very simple. There's 5 pages. You only need to fill out 4. We'll walk through them one by one. So relevant appropriations bills. Appropriations measures are so ginormous that they're subdivided into 12 bills. So you'll see from the names of these bills that most of them are pretty self-explanatory. For example, you'll know that a DHS FEMA grant is within the Homeland Security bill, but please, if you're not sure, just put I'm not sure. We have a team who's been doing this for many years. We pretty much know them all by heart. It's very easy for us to fill in the back end. So one other thing to highlight is that all requests must be submitted online through our form. We only take requests that are submitted through the form because we need all the information collected in this form in order to submit according to the committee rules. The agency is the federal agency that manages your grant. So you can find this in our grant resources guide, or honestly, just by Googling the name of the program or grant, it turns out pretty easily. The account gets a little trickier. So funding for each department and large independent agency in the government is organized into accounts. This is just going to be different for each agency. You can usually Google it, but if not, please just email me or leave it blank. I'm happy to backfill it or help work with you to find the answer. It can get a little ticky-tacky depending on which agency you're dealing with. And then the program often corresponds to the name of the grant or the office funding your organization. So an example would be Fermilab in our district. One of their main funding streams is from the Department of Energy. So that would be the agency. The account is the Office of Science within the Department of Energy, and the program is the High Energy Physics Program. On to page 2, there are 2 types of appropriations requests, to adjust a funding level or to add report language. You have to pick one of the 2. A funding request is really the most common. About 70% of our requests are funding requests. So I'm going to spend most of my time going over that. Funding request. This is the only page for the funding request information on our form. It's pretty simple. So you'll start here with the multiple choice. What do you want to do with your funding? Do you want to have a total number that you're advocating for? Do you want to have general support for a program? Do you just want to avoid cuts? Just pick whatever best corresponds to your request. The request amount is the total number of funding that you're asking for. These next 2 items, the FY21 and FY20 appropriated amount, are nice to have if you have them because the committee requires us to submit them. But if you don't have them and can't find them easily, don't worry about it. They're not required by our office because we can go through and work with you to fill in that information. Normally, we would ask for the amount in this program requested in President Biden's budget. Since that budget won't be out yet for this year with the change in administrations, feel free to just leave that blank for now. The most important part is a description of the program, its importance to the district, and why it's a good use of taxpayer dollars. So we often talk about providing both metrics and a story. So tell us what your organization does for the community, what this funding would do. That will help us tell your story here in DC. But also, if you can, provide metrics. Does your food bank serve 300 meals a day? Does your company employ 4 people in the district? Those are the types of things that really help us make the case for how big of an impact your request would make. And then lastly, we just have an optional section for any additional information you feel would be helpful. One thing I do want to really emphasize throughout this process is I am here to help answer any questions, as are the rest of our legislative team in DC. If my email should have been in the invite, I'll put it in the chat as well as my cell phone number. If you have any questions on this, especially since it's such an individualized process, call me, text me, email me, set up a phone call, we'll walk through it and make sure your request is in great shape. So this is report language. Report language refers to reports that the Appropriations Committee is required to produce to accompany its bills. They don't have the force of statute, but you can think of them as very strong hints for how the agency should use its own authority. So we'll often use words like strongly encouraged, the agency is strongly encouraged to do X. This can get very nuanced, but we can achieve a lot with it if we have the right details. So a really good way we can use report language is if you've applied for a grant and have been denied, we can help you set up a conversation with the agency to try and understand why you were denied. Let's say you were denied because your community was too small. The next year, we can add report language saying something like, the committee is strongly encouraged to dedicate a certain number of these grants to communities under 50,000 a year or under 50,000 in population, whatever sort of specific to your situation. So they're very nuanced. If you have questions about report language, I would recommend working out with me or reaching out to me so we can talk one-on-one. There's a lot of things you have to do to make sure that we're complying with all laws and ethics guidelines, but they can be very effective in individual cases. The last page on our appropriations form is just going to ask for your basic contact information. Another thing we get asked a lot about is who should submit the appropriations request. So it should be submitted by a community member who works to secure funding for the project. That could be the head of the organization, their financial officer, the government affairs officer, or really just anyone who works closely with the budget. We're also going to ask for the organization's location and address. A few details, including the location and substance of your request, may be made public, but we'll never share your name or other personal information without your permission. And if you have any questions about that, again, just shoot me an email. The other thing to highlight is what happens after I submit a request. So the House Appropriations Committee takes in all these requests. We get 70,000 a year. And our office tracks all of your requests throughout every stage of the process. So if you want to know where we are in the process, where your request is after it's been submitted, feel free to reach out to us. You can also find that information online at the Congressional Research Service. This link is in this slide and we'll share it below as well. A few more things I wanted to cover before we wrap up. Our deadline. So the deadline for appropriations requests that you're going to see on our website right now is March 5th. That is very, very flexible. If you are a constituent, it is almost totally flexible. I would aim for the second or third week in March right now. We're in a bit of a waiting period where with the transition administrations, we don't have a hard deadline yet, but you definitely have at least a couple weeks. And if you'll need more time, let me know. We can get special accommodations from the committee. And the other thing I wanted to highlight is just the importance of encouraging you to submit the same requests to Senators Durbin and Duckworth. We, of course, only influence the House side of these negotiations, and so having somebody who is a partner on the Senate side will be really valuable as well. They'll ask for roughly the same information, so it shouldn't be any extra work. I will turn it over to Michelle now to moderate any Q&A that we have, and then I'll just add, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and Jessica. Our information is here, our cell phone numbers. We are here anytime you have questions.
Thanks, Carolyn. It looks like there is one question about the president's fiscal year 22 budget line. Were you asking for the requested funding? I'm not sure. Terry had that question. Let me see.
Okay, let me see. I got it. All right. Good question, Terry. So no, it is not. So the president's budget line, you can just ignore for now because the president's budget is not out. Ask for requested funding in the FY22 funding box. It's the only required box on that page. So it has a little red asterisk next to it.
Great. Are there any more questions for Carolyn? We can, of course, take questions at the end as well.
I've got one from Patrick right here. Let's see, are there rules related to what an appropriation can be used for? For example, I've always been advised that funding can't be used for brick and mortar projects. Is that true? So there are rules on what an appropriation can be used for, but they tend to correspond with what the program or grant is allowed to do. So for example, if you're applying for a transportation grant, or an infrastructure grant, you would be allowed to use that for brick and mortar projects. And then your appropriations request would be simply to protect or increase the overall amount of funding in the program that funds that grant.
Okay, that's all the questions that I had. Now I'm going to play a quick little message from the Congresswoman who was not able to make it before we hand it over to Anna Keeter from Northern Illinois University. So hang on just a second.
Hello, and thank you for joining me this morning to learn about the federal appropriations process and how it can help our community. Today, we will cover how you can identify needs in your community that can be addressed with federal funding and how you can communicate those priorities to my office so that I can advocate for them throughout Congress's appropriations process. The appropriations process occurs annually. This year's process will fund programs for federal fiscal year 2022, which runs from October 2021 through September 2022. As you may know, this is my second term in Congress, and I am delighted to have been appointed to serve on the powerful Appropriations Committee, where many of these decisions are made. The Committee on Appropriations is responsible for funding the federal government's vital activities to keep the United States safe and invest in families and communities across the country. Throughout the 12 appropriations bills that the committee considers every year, Congress provides discretionary funding for priorities like national defense and homeland security, education and healthcare, transportation, and veteran services. Now, these bills account for a little more than a third of a total of federal spending. The remainder of federal spending comes from direct or mandatory spending for the military and programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. This process is an important opportunity for my office to protect or increase funding for agencies and programs that our community relies on. I'm excited for the opportunity to represent the interests of Illinois' 14th congressional district, including many of the people your organization serve, and ensure that our communities have the resources that they need to thrive. But to do this work most effectively, I need input from you, which is why I am so glad that you've made time to join us today. We ask that you share information about the federal funding and programs your organization relies on. And that means grants or government contracts, or perhaps federal agencies that play a critical role in supporting your organization. All of these are valid appropriations requests. Your input ensures that I can advocate for funding that benefits our congressional district. My team will share all the specifics with you on how to complete our appropriations request form and stay in touch with us throughout this process. We will also be recording today's workshop for your reference, and we'll share the recording afterwards. I'm delighted to be joined by a veteran of the federal appropriations process, Dr. Anna Keeter of Northern Illinois University, which serves so many residents of our district. Dr. Keeter will share her best tips and best practices for submitting appropriations requests on behalf of your organization. We've been so glad to work with Dr. Keeter and NIU on their appropriations needs over the past 2 years and have enjoyed some really important wins. All of NIU's appropriations requests last year resulted in stable or increased funding. Lastly, this is just one of the many resources our office has for helping your organization get federal funding. If you haven't already, I strongly encourage you to check out my new grant resource guide, which is available on my website at underwood.house.gov, and take a moment to get in touch with Jessica Beeshold, who leads grants for my office. She's based in Northern Illinois and can be reached at 630-549-2190. I hope you learned a lot today and feel empowered to engage in the appropriations and grant processes. Now I'd like to introduce Carolyn Paris-Bear, my legislative director, to provide background on the appropriations process and how to submit requests with our office. Hey, Carolyn.
Okay, it looks like we got a few more questions while we were playing the video. So I am going to take the first question about some library funding and hand that to Jessica Beeshold, if you'd like to go ahead and respond to that one.
Good morning, everyone. So the question came from Jane, and she said, we are a small, underfunded library doing this for the first time. What do you know about federal funding for libraries? So I would definitely suggest for any of the libraries that are watching today to sign up for our grants newsletter. So there are a few competitive grants that come up every year for libraries. And that way, if you sign up for that, we send that once a month. And we always include any of the grants that come out from IMLS. So that way it'll give you, a good indication of, when it's time to kind of think about applying for the competitive grants. I don't know if Carolyn wants to talk at all about maybe doing an appropriations request to, request funding for, the library. I think it's the LTSA appropriations, Carolyn?
Sure. So in addition to grants, there are obviously federal resources that support libraries that are broader than just one organization. So if those are really important to you or valuable, it's helpful for us to hear why. So I'd recommend submitting an appropriations request, just sharing your support for those resources.
Great. And then we got another question from Tony asking, we just completed this online survey last week, and he's referring to a federal funding survey that we sent around to our local governments to ask about any federal funding priority projects that they had. And then, he's just asking for the difference between the federal funding survey and the appropriations request. And I'll let Carolyn speak to this a little bit more, but specifically for your case, Tony, you provided enough information for us to use your federal funding responses as appropriations requests, but we wanted to also give you the opportunity to provide more information if you'd like to, specifically about those federal funding streams that you would want to rely on. Carolyn, I'll hand it back to you to add any additional information.
I'll just echo everything Michelle said. Yeah, we really appreciate you taking the time to participate.
Okay, and then we have one more question from James. The city of Sandwich is a small community in the district with many infrastructure problems. Is this the proper approach for water treatment, wastewater, sewer system, and the new public safety building?
Great question, and one we hear a lot. It's definitely one of the top needs of our district and one we're most focused on. If you haven't already, I would start by identifying the grant resource guide. If you're not already receiving federal support in order to make these changes, then an appropriations request isn't the best use of your time this cycle. But definitely look at the grant resources guide. There's a lot of stuff in there, and we can work with you to get those grants going and hopefully get some appropriations requests set up for next cycle.
Okay, great. I would like to now introduce Anna Keeter from Northern Illinois University to walk us through some best practices that she has. Thanks so much, Anna, for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to Congresswoman Underwood for the opportunity to speak with you all today. It's really a pleasure to be here. Today, I'm going to share some tips about navigating the appropriations process as a constituent organization. So my job at Northern Illinois University is to be the primary point of contact between the university and the federal government. One of my responsibilities is working with the Illinois congressional delegation on this annual appropriations process. So I work closely with Congresswoman Underwood's office on appropriations, and we are grateful for her support, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment. So I view the federal appropriations process as an important way for organizations to participate in democracy by helping our congressional representatives understand the importance of specific federal resources for their district. This, in turn, allows members of Congress to make informed decisions about how federal resources are allocated as well as advocating on our behalf. So participating in the federal appropriations process has several benefits, in my opinion. The main reason to participate, as you've heard today, is that doing so can protect or grow federal funding for programs and agencies that matter to your organization. But another benefit is that it prompts your organization to analyze the federal funding that supports your mission and articulate the benefits of those federal programs every year. Also, submitting appropriations requests informs the congressional offices about the on-the-ground impact of federal funding for their district, and it raises the office's awareness of your organization's priorities and needs. So highlighting heightened awareness of your organization can lead to more engagement with the congressional office, such as events or input on other policymaking. So as the Congresswoman mentioned, I'm happy to report that all of NIU's appropriations priorities last year saw flat or increased year-on-year funding. And we are grateful to Congresswoman Underwood for her support of our priorities last year, which spanned student financial aid programs, international education programs, and cutting-edge science and engineering research programs. Many of our priorities were slated for cuts or outright elimination in President Trump's annual presidential budget request, so strong support from our congressional champions was essential. So you've heard today about how to submit an appropriations request. But before you can submit an appropriations request, you need to know what your appropriations priorities are as an organization. So I'm going to tell you a bit about how we do our prioritization process within NIU, and then how we translate that into filling in the forms. So NIU is a large and complex organization, and we have many points of interaction with the federal government. So to figure out where to start with NIU's appropriations requests, I look at which federal agencies and programs currently provide funding to our students and faculty. So NIU's Office of Sponsored Programs Administration actually publishes publicly available annual report that lists all of our federal grants and contracts. From this report, I can see, for example, that in fiscal year 2020, NIU received 126 federal awards totaling $33 million, and I can see which federal agencies the funding flowed from. And again, this is a publicly available report on our website. I also work with our Office of Financial Aid and Scholarships to determine which and to what extent federal student financial aid programs provide funding to NIU students. So once I've put together a draft list of priorities based on our annual federal funding analysis, that list is reviewed internally and it's finalized. So NIU usually has a couple dozen appropriations requests every year. And as you would imagine, a lot of them, there isn't a huge amount of change year to year, but it's still important for us to go through that process. So once you know your organization's appropriations priorities, you need to find the right information to fill in the appropriations request form that was discussed earlier. So this is where I turn to the national associations and coalitions that NIU participates in. And I'll just say the effectiveness of your organization's appropriations request is usually enhanced by coordinating with organizations like yours across the state of Illinois and across the country, especially if you're all requesting funding for the same agencies and programs. So national associations and coalitions often have recommendations for the amount of funding, and they tell you, the specific programs and all those details that you heard you need for the form. They often have specific information, and they create documents that can help you fill in your appropriations requests. So if you don't know if your organizations, your associations or coalitions, if you don't know that they produce those resources, reach out to them and ask. Honestly, they'll probably be happy to hear from you, and they'll be very interested in the fact that you want to submit an appropriations request, and they'll probably help you. So for the NIU example, in my case, I rely on the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities for this information. So they coordinate, the APLU, they coordinate with many other associations and coalitions to come up with funding levels that we're all going to ask for the agencies that matter to all of the public university members of this association. So I'm going to share a link in the chat, which is this year's appropriations priorities chart for the APLU. Let me put that in the chat right now so that you can take a look at that. Panelists and attendees. Okay, I'm also going to share a link as that's an example of an advocacy narrative that APLU puts together. And again, these are, they put these right on their website for us members to access. And I want to be clear, I don't submit, or NIU doesn't submit appropriations requests for every one of APLU's priorities. That's why we go through the initial step of doing the internal process to figure out what NIU's priorities are. So when I submit an appropriations request for NIU, I use the information from these APLU documents, but I also couple that with data, examples, and narrative specific to NIU, and if possible, specific to a congressional office. And so, for example, when I submit a request to Congresswoman Underwood's office asking her to support Pell Grants for this year, Pell Grants are means-tested federal grants to students that they use primarily for tuition. I'm going to be sure to include that 45% of NIU students are Pell Grant recipients, and that includes over 600 current Pell Grant recipients from her district. So thanks to today's workshop, you are now equipped to submit appropriations requests to Congresswoman Underwood's office, as well as most other Illinois congressional offices, because nearly every office in the Illinois delegation requests the same information for an appropriations request. Illinois has the 5th largest congressional delegation in the United States, and our 18 House representatives and 2 senators, they want to fight for our interests, but they need to hear from us to do so. It is a lot of work to fill in a form for every request for all 20 Illinois congressional offices. Like, I get it. So what I do is I'm strategic regarding which appropriations requests I send to which office. And I try to match the appropriations requests that I make with the interests of the congressional office. And so that said, I encourage you to, especially to consider submitting appropriations requests to Senator Durbin and Senator Duckworth, as well as Congressman Quigley and Congresswoman Bustos. Senator Durbin and Representatives Bustos and Quigley all serve on the appropriations committees for the House or the Senate, along with Congresswoman Underwood. So thank you for your time today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Anna. If anybody has any questions at this time, you're more than welcome to ask them in the Q&A or in the chat. And you can also raise your hand and we can call on you to ask your question live. Okay, just a reminder that you're welcome to reach out to our office with any questions that you may have. We will follow up with you shortly with some additional documents that you might find helpful, as well as contact information for the staff in our office who will be able to help you with the appropriations process and separately grants if you'd like assistance with that. So thank you everybody for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.